Today, we will hear witnesses describe not only the impacts of traffic safety enforcement, which disproportionately affect people of color, but methods to improve trust between communities and law enforcement to bring about safe, equitable, and just outcomes in these interactions. We will also hear about the importance of using traffic safety resources to address problems that lead to injuries and deaths, such as impaired driving, rather than traffic stops that are used as a sweeping tool to interact with communities. Targeting resources is necessary to ensure that we actually move the needle on traffic safety. I'm especially interested to hear testimony from Ken Barone of Central Connecticut State University. The reason I am interested is he is program manager of the state of Connecticut's Racial Programming Prohibition Project, which is supported by a grant program I champion to prohibit racial profiling, known as Section 1906, that has been a great success. It is my understanding that other states are seeking to replicate the Connecticut model, so I very much look forward to hearing more about that program. Thank you for participating in today's hearing. I look forward to learning more about what the committee can do to ensure that traffic safety enforcement is fair as well as safe for all Americans.
Mr. Ken Barone.
Good morning. Chair DeFazio, Chair Norton, Ranking Member Davis, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. My name is Ken Barone, and I'm the manager of the State of Connecticut's Racial Profiling Prohibition Project. My testimony today will focus on the benefits that the Section 1906 Racial Profiling Prohibition Grant Program has had on Connecticut's ability to address both equity and safety in traffic enforcement, and the value of expanding the funding to allow for even greater progress in eliminating racial profiling in traffic enforcement while also working to improve the safety of our roadways. Traffic stops are the most common encounter between law enforcement and the public. Understanding these routine interactions requires states to move beyond anecdotal conversations and to develop robust data collection and analysis programs. Connecticut first enacted an anti-racial profiling law in 1999. However, until resources were provided through the 1906 program, Connecticut struggled to properly implement the law. With the support of the 1906 grant program, we have developed a state-of-the-art data collection and analysis system. To date, we have collected over 91 million data points from more than 3.5 million traffic stops. Beyond simply collecting data, we have also conducted meaningful statewide and departmental analysis over the last 6 years. Our analysis is designed to identify both statewide trends and those departments with the most significant racial and ethnic disparities. Rather than treating the analysis as evidence of wrongdoing, we utilize the analysis as an early intervention system. This approach allows us to focus our limited resources on those departments that have the most significant racial and ethnic disparities. Departmental interventions are designed to be a collaboration between researchers, the law enforcement agency, and community stakeholders. These departmental interventions have produced important, actionable findings that departments have used to enact positive change. Since 2015, Connecticut's statewide analysis has consistently identified some of the following trends. Black and Hispanic drivers are disproportionately stopped and disproportionately searched when compared to white drivers. Police are significantly less likely to find contraband resulting from a search involving a Black or Hispanic driver. Black and Hispanic drivers are stopped at a greater rate for equipment violations and other administrative offenses when compared to white drivers. However, there is little evidence to support a claim that Black and Hispanic drivers more frequently commit these offenses. Racial and ethnic disparities are significantly. Traffic enforcement is primarily focused on hazardous driving behaviors. Although the primary motivation behind our work has been to identify and address racial and ethnic disparities in traffic enforcement, an added benefit to the program has been the accumulation of a rich data set that can inform researchers, practitioners, and transportation and law enforcement administrators about the enforcement techniques that are most effective in improving roadway safety. I want to be very clear. Our program has consistently shown that it is possible to eliminate racial and ethnic disparities in traffic enforcement and improve roadway safety at the same time. The 1906 program has been critical to our success in Connecticut. It has allowed our state to dive headfirst into an emotional and often traumatic conversation and create meaningful and measurable reform by positively addressing both equity and safety in traffic enforcement, all with stakeholders at the helm. We're proud that in recent years, our approach has been replicated in at least 3 other states, including California, Oregon, and Rhode Island. I'd be remiss if I didn't take this opportunity to mention the important role that state departments of transportation play in administering this grant program. We are grateful for the continued support of the Connecticut Department of Transportation. In closing, I ask that you strongly consider the reauthorization and expansion of the 1906 program so that Connecticut and other states can continue to make progress on racial equity in traffic enforcement. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Barone. In fact, your program is of special interest to me since my bill established the 1906 program. We will proceed to questions now. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Barone, I mentioned your program in my own opening remarks. I championed Section 1906, and so I'd like to hear more about how it is operated and why it has been successful in Connecticut against racial profiling. Apparently, you simply didn't treat your findings as evidence of wrongdoing. That's where you began. What are some of the outcomes you've been able to achieve in Connecticut to address racial disparities in traffic stops using this approach? No wrongdoing instead of the Connecticut, using the Connecticut approach.
Thank you for the question, Chair Norton, and thank you for your continued support. Has largely been the result of 2 factors. One is a statewide creation of an advisory board of stakeholders that have met monthly for the better part of 8 years to try and tackle this issue. The second thing that has led to the success of this program are departmental interventions. We've often seen across the country researchers come in, do a statewide study, and simply point the finger at police agencies, tell them they have a problem, and not help them figure out what's driving that problem or help them determine what solutions they can implement to address that problem. And so we felt that it was our obligation as researchers not to simply point the finger at law enforcement and walk away. So we spend our time now identifying agencies that require our attention. We go in and we work with those agencies along with community stakeholders to try and better understand what are the factors driving disparities. I'll give you one example to put a finer point on it. We had an agency in Connecticut that had a significant racial disparity being driven by their use of low-level lighting enforcement. They made 1,608 traffic stops in a 12-month time period for defective lighting. And they had articulated that it was part of their roving DUI patrol. They were looking for drunk drivers without ever having realized that out of the 1,608 stops for low-level lighting violations, they had only identified 1 drunk driver. But in fact, they were much more successful at identifying drunk drivers when they used techniques that didn't have racial and ethnic disparities in the outcomes and were more likely to identify drunk drivers like certain hazardous moving violations. That level of analysis, those levels of conversation, and that level of intervention in that case is what has led to reforms in that agencies. We've been fortunate to do 28 departmental interventions out of 107 agencies in the state of Connecticut. And we've made findings in all 28 agencies and helped all 28 agencies improve the outcomes of their stops as a result of those interventions and us staying at the table with stakeholders throughout the process.
Mr. Barone, I'd like to know whether or not other states have been able to replicate the model you've achieved in Connecticut and with the same level of success. And I'd like to know about how much funding. Do you believe you could do more with additional federal investment, or is funding just not an issue here? Could you answer those two questions?
Yes, so currently 3 states have replicated to some version the Connecticut model: Rhode Island, California, and Oregon, all to great success. The same type of approach: stakeholders, research, departmental intervention. The reality is that the funding is not nearly enough. Every state receives that applies for this funding receives $375,000 grant a year. And in these challenging fiscal times, previously in Connecticut, for example, we were fortunate to have funding offset by state money, which in recent years has dried up. And obviously in larger states like California and Oregon, that's challenging as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Barone. And your testimony that it has been replicated suggests to me that this committee would want to do more to see that it's replicated, and you say 3 states and even more states. So I very much appreciate that testimony regarding this innovation.
You stated that disparities in the criminal justice system, particularly police enforcement, there's been a major source of political protests and social unrest in the United States. Motor vehicle enforcement is a common focus of these conversations since it is the public's most frequent interaction with law enforcement. What role does the collection of data play in equity and in transportation safety enforcement and combating racial profiling?
Thank you for the question, Representative. I can tell you that in the absence of data, we've been having these conversations anecdotally, and people have come forward with their experiences, which are important to share and powerful, but they've often been refuted by law enforcement. And once the whole cold, hard facts are presented, we can finally advance the conversation, not to whether the problem exists, well, what do we do about the problem? And when we started this work, for example, in Connecticut, we were still arguing over whether we had a problem. And once we finally collected the data, we could go and say, we can't be arguing anymore about whether this exists. Those stories that people have been presenting, that they've been sharing over recent years, they need to be believed because the data supports them, which is why it's critical that we collect this information moving forward.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate it. And I thank all who have testified today and sharing their expertise. I wanted to ask Mr. Barone a question. You said in your testimony that only 23 states had applied for the Section 1906 funding. And that's not all the states. Are the states that have not applied, are they resistant to collecting such data, or are there other reasons why these states are not applying for these funds?
So we know that there are over 30 states that require some form of data collection with regards to information on traffic stops. And in my experience in talking to a number of states and in talking to a number of organizations like the Council of State Governments, which has networks in all the states, one of the reasons why states have not always taken advantage of the 1906 program is largely because of a lack of knowledge and a bit of a disconnect. The 1906 program resides in the highway safety offices, typically in state departments of transportation, and oftentimes the work that's being done in states to address racial disparities in policing is being done by some criminal justice entity. So there's been a bit of a disconnect, and I believe that that this program would benefit from a technical advisor, like many DOJ grant programs are established, so that some entity can come in and help NHTSA get the word out that these funds are available, and to help states that A, already collect this data, utilize this funding to enhance their program, and B, to reach out to states that aren't currently collecting data to build this infrastructure. And again, I just think that bringing in some technical advisor to help NHTSA on that would go a long way in getting more states to know about the money, to use the money, and to partner the transportation folks with the criminal justice folks.
Thanks for that. And I noticed that, California is one of the states that has replicated your model, but they are also one of the states that haven't applied for the 1906 funds. Do you have any idea why California is not doing it? Do they fall into the trap that you just described?
So I've been fortunate enough to have done some work in California as they helped to get their program up and running and their law passed in 2015. And the reality is, I think it's what I mentioned earlier, which is that $375,000 a year in California, right, just doesn't go that far. And then you've got to talk about all the work that goes into applying for and oversight of receiving and spending the federal dollars. It's just a challenge in California. I can't speak for them, but they may have made a calculation that, they have, over 400 police agencies in California that are going to be collecting data. And so it's a much different challenge than, say, we had in Connecticut, where there's 100 agencies and we're a smaller state. And it's one of the reasons why I'd advocate for additional resources to be spent that states could have access to really ensure that resources are provided through this program.
Thank you for that.
I have a question for Mr. Barone, and I'm glad to, sir, to see your success with Connecticut had with 1906. But do you believe the Federal Department of Transportation is better equipped than the DOJ, the Department of Justice, to work with law enforcement agencies as it relates to racial profiling or racial bias?
Thank you for the question, Representative. I can tell you that the 1906 program has been used to help states grapple with this issue themselves, and that the Department of Justice, in the case of Connecticut, there's oftentimes when we've taken our data and gone to the Department of Justice and asked them to review things. But the federal agency, NHTSA, doesn't play a role in the evaluating or in the establishment of the system that collects and analyzes data. It's designed so that states can best create the programs that work best for them and their localities. And so there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. The approach we take in Connecticut, although it's been replicated in other states, they've taken their own modifications to that program to best fit what meets their needs on a local level. So I just want to be clear that the federal agency, being NHTSA, really has been there to support the passing through of funds to allow states to do this important work. What we've consistently found in Connecticut and other states we've worked in is that when law enforcement used the traffic code to primarily focus on the safety of the roadways, not only is the safety of the roadways improved, but we see decreased racial and ethnic disparities. When traffic enforcement starts to be used as a crime reduction tool, when it starts to be used as an immigration tool, not only does it drive up racial and ethnic disparities, it also reduces trust and legitimacy in police, and it impacts the safety of the roadways, because attention, time, and resources are being taken away from those stops that we know cause accidents and death.
But we do not punish any law enforcement agencies, not just the police officers, the agencies, for not following the law. How do we go around that?
So I don't have a comment on that. I'm mostly focused on the data. I know in Connecticut, we have outlawed the type of policing practice that you're speaking about. And we've had good success in that here in Connecticut.
So this is for Mr. Barone. From your experience, sir, what real-world differences can happen when states themselves maintain and make public available statistical information on each motor vehicle stop made by law enforcement? And how can the federal government better support our states by making these targeted efforts to reduce racial bias in policing? Thank you.
Thank you, Representative, for the question and the very important question at that. Transparency is key to legitimacy in policing, and it is the first step to rebuilding trust in law enforcement and the communities they serve. Beyond that, simply sharing data is step one. Step two is having the people that know what that data says to sit down with community stakeholders and law enforcement and figure out why the data looks the way it does. I'll tell you from our experience here in Connecticut, we have 107 police agencies. Every year we did our annual report starting in 2014. We saw significant racial and ethnic statewide disparities. And we would identify a group of departments that were really contributing to that disparity more so than others. We began to work with them, to have interventions with them, to figure out what are the factors driving these disparities and getting departments to make changes. The most recent report that we've published has shown a significant decrease over the last 6 years in statewide racial and ethnic disparities. Why? Because we've had time to intervene in 28 of our 107 departments, all 28 departments doing a little something to reduce the disparity in their department, which has contributed to an overall reduction in the statewide basis. So people often think this can be done overnight. There needs to be vigilance. There needs to be continued collection, continued analysis, and continued conversations. You know, I know sometimes people don't want to hear this, but slow and steady wins the race. We've been at this thoughtfully and methodically in Connecticut for almost a decade now, and our work is finally paying off. The longer we wait, the longer it will pay off in other states. And the 1906 program is a great place to start for the federal government to be able to support this type of state level work.
Great, well, thank you for that. And to be clear, as our witnesses testified today, this is a safety issue. This is about safety. And when there's not equity in enforcement, there is one less officer getting an unsafe driver off the road to protect all of us. So now for Ms. Hawkins or Mr. Barone or Mr. Ray, based on your research experience, how can addressing this issue of bias with data, with collecting it, with reporting and analyzing it, actually improve our roadway safety?
I'll start and just say that we now have lots of data that tells us when police focus on the things that have the biggest contributor to accidents, speeding, traveling too closely, talking on their cell phone, drinking and driving, we see very little racial and ethnic disparities in the data because they're focused on the violation. When policing starts to use traffic laws as a crime reduction tool, it tends to drive disparities. We also know that drivers commit motor vehicle violations at the same rate, regardless of their race. And police will find what they're looking for where they look for it. But we know that they look for different violations in Black and brown communities than they do in white communities. And in some regards, we've created a self-fulfilling prophecy, this idea that Black and brown drivers are more likely to have an administrative offense, and somehow that's linked to poverty. But we know that police run, for example, plates in Black and brown communities at a significantly higher rate than they do in white communities to look for these administrative offenses. So the knowledge that this program has been able to do is to inform that, to start asking questions. Why are you running plates here and not here? Right? Why are you doing speed enforcement here and not here? And how is that linked to traffic safety? And so all of this can come together. And as I continue to say, we can create win-win scenarios. We can improve traffic safety and eliminate racial disparities.
All right, well, thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I yield back.
Mr. Barone, let me ask you this question. Your findings state that Black and Hispanic drivers are stopped more frequently by law enforcement for vehicle equipment and administrative-related driving offenses. Despite there being no evidence, Black and Hispanic drivers commit these offenses more often than white drivers. Based on your experience working with law enforcement agencies, have you found officers believe vehicle-related violations correlate to dangerous driving behaviors, or are they just an excuse to stop somebody who they might be able to make a collar on?
I found that in some regards, Representative, that in law enforcement, we've created self-fulfilling prophecies, right? So this idea that there's a connection between socioeconomic status and the maintenance of the equipment of your vehicle or administrative offenses. And therefore, when police are asked to go in Connecticut, for example, to ensure that vehicles are properly registered, they tend to go look for those violations where their implicit bias tells them they think they're more likely to find them. And when they run plates, for example, and they find unregistered vehicles, it then reaffirms what they previously believed. Yet we know that if the same exposure was made, police running plates, for example, in predominantly white neighborhoods, we know that they would find administrative offenses at the same rate. And so, frankly, the conversations we've had with law enforcement have been informative to them as well. Them realizing that that the correlations that they thought existed don't necessarily exist. And we've worked to help them to say, what is the issue that you're trying to address? If you're trying to address unregistered vehicles on your roads, let's figure out the most fair and equitable way for law enforcement to look for those violations. If you're trying to address
Thank you,
speeding,
Mr. Barone.
So specifically, Mr. Barone, I want to thank you for your work, but also your passion for your work. You referenced in your testimony some research you did in New Haven, Connecticut, in a predominantly African-American community where traffic stops were accelerated, and your findings were compelling as to the efficacy of those that enforcement. I want to ask you, when you shared it with the local police department, these statistics, what happened with that information? Was it well received? Did it lead to any kind of policy changes, specifically in that neighborhood and in New Haven?
Thank you for the question. The work that we've done in Connecticut has, a component of it has been to engage in the community in a dialogue about what policing looks like and what it should look like, but one that's informed based on the data. And so in the example I provided in my testimony, it was a predominantly white suburban community that bordered the city of New Haven that was focusing a lot of attention in a predominantly Black neighborhood within the community that also bordered the city, which is also predominantly Black and Hispanic. And the policing looked very different in that neighborhood and in that area than it did elsewhere in town. And the department was fairly open to engaging in a thoughtful dialogue with us about what was driving the disparities, why they believed those disparities existed. And we spent a long time working with the department to drill down on that. So they would say, for example, we place more cops in this area because we have more crime here. Okay, and so we would go back and look at that, and then we'd say, well, let's figure out what your police are doing and how that is helping to impact or reduce crime, and is that causing a disparity? And if it is, what can we do to address that? We were happy to report that because of the changes that we made and the dialogue that we had with the department and their willingness to engage in this dialogue with the community, it wasn't very long before their racial and ethnic disparity disappeared. Community trust increased, legitimacy in policing increased, and that was largely driven by their willingness to engage in this level of a thoughtful discussion. And we really took that model, that was early on. We started bringing that type of collaboration to the other agencies we worked with. In addition to working directly with departments, we also host several forums with the community and the police department and stakeholders in the basement of church halls and in town hall auditoriums to engage in this important dialogue. And that's a really important component of the work we do.
Just a follow-up on that. Having been a mayor of a city of 130,000 people here in the Bay Area that reasonably, well, is diverse and was diverse then, I think back of community-oriented policing 25, 30 years ago, and these cultural changes. And I just wondered, as a follow-up to your comments, how you find in engaging over time in cultures in local police departments that are more open, more based on community-oriented policing? And has that made a difference, as far as you know, over the last 3 decades?
It has been. These haven't always been easy conversations to have. I'll be honest with you. Usually when we do our initial analysis, we drive down, we meet with the department, we sit across the conference table with them for a few hours. And those first few hours are often a little contentious, right? Nobody wants to be named in a report that says they might have an issue with race. But usually once we can let the data ground the conversation, we can start to move beyond some of the emotion that's brought to the table, and we can start to really look at what can be done to address the issue. And a big thing that we push for in our work is to not have it be done in a silo or in a vacuum, but to make sure that we bring community stakeholders into the conversation, so that usually when law enforcement hear directly from the people they serve, they're a little bit more open to implementing those reforms that we've seen work.
Well, I can start, but I do think Mr. Barone can provide some history, because he's gone to other states and brought his incredible program there. The first thing is to show some examples, and that's what he has done so successfully, and how it has changed in a non-threatening, non-blame-based approach, the way that practices are implemented, and truly resulted in both more equity and safer streets, which is really what we're all after. As I mentioned before, we could consider when a state hasn't chosen to be part of the programs, whether localities could, towns, cities, and that may open things up a bit and give you an example in your state that you could bring more broadly. So that's just another thing to consider, and I'll give the time back over to the expert in Connecticut.
Thank you, Ms. Martin, and thanks for the question. I would agree with everything Ms. Martin said, and I would also go back to the comments I made earlier regarding the benefits of potentially allowing for technical assistance so that we can really ensure that states know that these resources are available, and to help states access the resources and put together a program that does exactly what we've been able to do in Connecticut, which is address equity and roadway safety. I think once people have a better understanding, for example, of what we've been able to do, it might incentivize them to want to engage in this program. And I also think in those states where maybe state lawmakers are less interested in a state approach, which we've been fortunate to have in Connecticut, allowing localities to potentially access these funds to do this type of work at the local level would also go a long way in showing the benefits of the program.
Great, thank you. I am definitely interested in finding ways to let localities access this program, make them aware of it, and help them use that.
I would like to ask, are there any further questions from members of the subcommittee, either on webcam or in person? Seeing none, I want to thank each of our witnesses in particular for your very helpful testimony today. Your comments have been informative and helpful, and beyond that, your comments have been full of information and insights that I know I did not have. And I feel comfortable in saying that most members of the committee on both sides did not yet have, and that we need to take into account in any further legislation that is enacted. I now ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them further in writing. I also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's very helpful hearings. Without objection, so ordered. The subcommittee stands adjourned.